Formula One in 2022 is well and truly back. Round one in Bahrain done, and we are straight into another race week. Just enough time then to have a midweek chat about all the major news from Bahrain as we head now into Saudi Arabia. Welcome along. This is indeed the Crash F1 podcast. The recording date is Tuesday, the 22nd of March. My name is Harry Benjamin. Alongside me, Crash's F1 editor Lewis Larkam, Formula One commentator for the likes of the BBC and Channel 4, Ben Edwards, and I'm pleased to say we have a special guest joining us too in the form of racefans.net F1 journalist Claire Cottingham. Lovely to have you all here with me for only our second episode. Ben, let's start with you as well. Lovely to have you back as well. Fresh from your first weekend in the booth too. What did you make of all the action from the opening round of the year?
Oh, I loved it. I really enjoyed myself, I have to say. Yeah, I was commentating again on this one, and it was a good fun race to commentate on, and it's such a fascinating weekend with all the new cars and none of us really knowing quite who was going to come out on top. I know you asked us for our predictions. I certainly got it wrong, but it was fascinating, and to see how close Red Bull and Ferrari are was thrilling. To see Verstappen and Leclerc going wheel to wheel several times, thoroughly enjoyable. Mercedes obviously on the struggle, but the reliability worked for them, and there were so many aspects to that event really that we can talk about that were fun. You know, surprise performances from some of the midfield, both up and down. So yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Well, it certainly was a cracker of a start, wasn't it, Ben? Lewis, as well, you've just flown back from Bahrain. How was your first visit to the desert? I saw your pictures. The grid looked incredibly, it looked insane.
Yeah, no, it was a fantastic experience. First time for me actually being on the F1 grid. So yeah, that was a really surreal, crazy experience. So overwhelming being on the grid, and yeah, just a completely crazy sort of. It's hard to describe it until you actually get there and experience it. But yeah, no, a brilliant weekend, an exciting start to the season. So yeah, really good.
Nice one. And Claire, well, massive welcome. You had the honour of being our first ever guest. Could be first, could be last. We'll see how it goes. But like Lewis, you're also on the ground as well. In fact, you're still there in Bahrain, aren't you? You're heading over to Saudi Arabia. What did you glean from walking up and down the paddock last weekend?
It was really interesting. I mean, I've been in Bahrain now for what feels like about 40 years because I was here for the test as well. So it was really interesting to see the difference between the paddock during the test and then the paddock during the race. I couldn't really work out that F1 was back, and I almost wasn't ready for it because it just felt like it crept up, like we had no time off. And then suddenly it was like, hi, let's all celebrate 2022 cars. So it felt quite overwhelming during the actual race weekend. And I felt like quite a few people probably felt a bit like that through it as well. We weren't really sure, you know, because obviously we didn't know what was going to happen with what the cars were going to do, were they going to be good, were they going to be rubbish. We had no idea. So it was a real unknown feeling coming into this weekend. But I have to say it didn't disappoint. It was an incredible race.
It really didn't it? It was what Formula One needed, I think, after sort of the debacle of the end of last season, to start afresh with some good racing and a clean racing as well, which is great to see. But I suppose, you know, you mentioned there, Claire, about the new regulations, and that is, of course, what everyone's talking about. But Ben, as well, firsthand watching it from the booth, the big question is, have these new regulations worked? Is it too soon to really say they've worked? We got some good close racing in Bahrain.
We did. It's given me some confidence that it is helping, I have to say. I mean, the battle we saw between Verstappen and Leclerc, I do understand that Verstappen, he had a braking temperature problem, which did affect how hard he could attack in some ways. But no, it's definitely given me some confidence that what they've done is going to help with the overall amount of overtaking and the battling that's going on. I think, obviously, it's going to take a few races for us to really learn. Bahrain, we've seen some good wheel-to-wheel action in the past before this came along. Remember that Rosberg-Hamilton race of some years ago where they were side by side. And so, it's possible. But it did give me encouragement, I have to say, that the new rules are going to make the racing better.
Yeah, absolutely. Lewis and Claire, what did you make of it as well on the ground with these new regs? Did the drivers feedback saying, I think Alonso said recently that overtaking is still difficult, but you can certainly follow a little bit closer than last year?
Yeah, I think the overall feedback is positive. particularly when it comes to following. Most of the drivers are saying that it's far better, easier to follow. Overtaking itself is still difficult, and particularly when you're getting into the slipstream of the car behind, the effect doesn't seem to be as strong as it used to be, although DRS was obviously helped in that sense. So some mixed feedback, but I suspect that was largely down to dependent on where drivers finished, because Kevin Magnussen was particularly enthusiastic about the new rules, saying it was far better for following, and obviously he had a great result, whereas Lando Norris was a bit more frustrated and said he couldn't follow, couldn't overtake, and obviously he finished down in 15th. So I think you've got to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt. But overall, I'd say that, yeah, positive start. The real question mark is how, when we come to races, the next few races coming up in Saudi, Australia and Imola are circuits where traditionally overtaking has been particularly difficult. So that might be more of a test compared to Bahrain, where, as Ben said, overtaking has actually been possible in the past.
Yeah, similar to what Lewis said in terms of drivers' feedback. Some drivers who did well were very happy and enjoyed what they were seeing on track. Someone like Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris, they clearly have. But in fairness to Lando and Daniel, they weren't saying it was the regulations that were difficult. They were just saying that their car wasn't very good and that they were struggling a lot with downforce and that they had so much to hook up that they just weren't unlocking. And that's mostly what their complaint was. It wasn't actually anything to do, from what I heard, with the regulations. I think Lando did mention sort of it was hard to overtake, but when you have a poor start and then you're at the back anyway, it's always going to be quite difficult for you anyway. Unless you're in a Mercedes that Lewis Hamilton had last year, it just isn't possible. So I think it's really interesting to see what the drivers have been saying. But again, like Lewis says, Bahrain is such a different track from so many other tracks. It's set at a completely different time from other tracks as well. It's a dusk race. It's just completely different from a lot of the rest of the calendar. So it's going to be interesting when we see things like even street racing like Monaco, or what's going to happen in Baku, or there's so much that we're gonna unlock throughout this whole season. It's going to be like a video game of every single time we're like, oh, new level unlocked, So it's going to be really fascinating. But I think it is too soon to really jump on that hype train at the moment.
Oh, so you're not thinking then Ferrari domination time, like Mercedes when the hybrid era started in 2014, Ferrari kicking off with a 1-2. They're surely the ones to beat, though.
Well, I mean, look, if you start and you win the race and you get a 1-2, you're clearly in a good position, aren't you, to be favourites going into the rest of the season. It doesn't necessarily mean that's what we'll see, because Mercedes, I think, have a lot to unlock, and I think they will unlock stuff. And you have to remember, Red Bull were in a really strong position before both of their cars went kaput. So, yes, Ferrari are looking incredibly strong at the moment, reliability-wise and speed-wise. Max was chasing Charles down, whether he'd got past him and didn't have those issues. And then, it could change so quickly. It is literally only the first race of the season. I believe Ferrari are strong. I don't believe that they are the only ones that are strong out there.
Well, it certainly is a competitive grid, especially in that top order as well. We'll come on, and you bring up McLaren, we'll come on to them in a little bit. But let's sort of focus on the top, and especially with the news breaking, Ben, in the last sort of couple of hours, that it's expected that Carlos Sainz is going to extend his Ferrari Formula One contract as well. Absolute masterclass from Ferrari over the weekend. Leclerc particularly looking strong all throughout. Sainz admitted, he was maybe about a tenth off the pace, just couldn't quite find that little extra something. But to have a bad day and still come second, this is looking good for Ferrari. And it eases the pressure as well on Mattia Binotto after what has been, a tough, few years, let's be honest.
Yeah, and this is the crucial phase for him, because he was always going to be the one to set up for this change of regulations. And to be fair, it's looking good. I thought Carlos was hard on himself, both after qualifying and after the race, saying he didn't ever quite get to where Charles was, that he felt the gap was bigger to Charles here at this first race than it had been throughout last year. He's an interesting guy, isn't he, Carlos? He will knock himself rather than sort of knock the team and say, oh, they haven't set the car up for me, they've set it up for Charles. Very straight. I was quite impressed by that. But I think it's a very good pairing. I think we all feel that that's a very strong pairing in Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. Is it going to stay friendly? Because if you've got the best car, it is a little bit of a concern that if they start fighting for the championship, the two of them, will they manage to maintain that good relationship? Sadly, in the past, we've seen that go wrong. Gilles Villeneuve and Didier Pironi were good mates back in the day, but they fell out badly after an incident at Imola, and then of course it all went horribly wrong after that. So let's just hope that they can work together, and if they are the sort of lead team throughout, that they don't get too rough with each other.
History has certainly repeated itself multiple times in Formula 1, hasn't it? Well, we'll hope that it all stays friendly. Only one race down. But just on the Sainz contract, Lewis, do we know much about it at the moment? Do we know? I'm assuming it's going to be a long-term contract.
No details on that as yet, but obviously Carlos in the past has been keen to tie himself down to multiple year deals. So it wouldn't be surprised from his side if he was looking for at least another 2-year deal. But obviously this has ramifications on Ferrari's young driver program as well, because Charles Leclerc is set down for a long time with Ferrari. And if Sainz had a mid-term contract too, then you've got the question of where does that leave Mick Schumacher and the other Ferrari juniors too, because Ferrari do have a fantastic driver lineup. I personally think it's the strongest on the grid, but there is that question mark then of where that leaves the future drivers coming through for Ferrari. But yeah, as Ben touched on, the real sort of dilemma for Ferrari potentially this season, if they do have the quickest car all year long, is how is that relationship between Carlos and Charles going to pan out, because they've never fought for the world title before. And yeah, will there be sort of fireworks there between the two of them? How will Ferrari manage that? And could that be something that plays into the hands of Red Bull, where they are obviously throwing all their weight behind Max Verstappen, who is normally ahead of Sergio Perez anyway, and that could be something that ultimately could decide the outcome of the World Championship and how that is handled. So I think that would be something to keep an eye on as the season develops.
I know really it's something that team bosses always say, though. We'd rather have that than the alternative. You know, they're always, in a way, when they're asked, "Oh, how's it going to be between your two top drivers?" They always say, "Well, we've got winning car. That's the least of our problems in a way." So I remember Toto talking about that when it was Nico versus Lewis. You know, so it's going to be interesting.
It really will be interesting, isn't it? And especially, everyone thought Leclerc was sort of the Ferrari golden boy, and then Carlos Sainz comes in and absolutely sort of, shows that he's certainly one to watch. Let's move on to Mercedes and Red Bull, Claire. Mercedes, I suppose it turned out to be a fairly decent weekend for them. Everyone thought they'd be sandbagging, but actually it turned out they weren't lying. It was damage limitation. Hamilton did manage to get a podium, and he was elated with that. I came across the radio, and what he said, I thought on the radio afterwards, so crucial. Reliability is so important, especially in this new era of Formula One.
I know, and in some ways it was always a bit of a running joke, wasn't it, over the last couple of years, that even if Lewis had a disastrous Saturday, somehow he would end up on the podium. And this was one of the first races where I was like, there's no way. He's just not going to make it. And then suddenly the Red Bull started tumbling down the order, and Verstappen was out and Perez was out. And suddenly you're like, oh, the whole race has just completely turned on its head for Mercedes, who, we have to say, were in a lucky position. Yes, they were reliable and they were consistent throughout the whole race. But did they really, is the car really in a place where it deserves to be third on the podium? I don't think so. So I was incredibly surprised to hear when we came into this, obviously Toto being so downbeat about it, and Lewis pretty much saying, we're not fighting for wins, we are not. And we were all a bit like, sure, okay. But then you saw the cars on track and you were like, probably actually you're quite weak, in that sort of, compared to the Red Bulls and the Ferraris. And then we all say, well, it's only testing, so who knows? And the race was what we had to go with, qualifying obviously first and then the race, and the race was solid for them. But they have a lot of work to do. They do have a lot of work to do, and I think they are not completely not going to be contenders. That's a terrible sentence, but you know what I mean. But I think they will be waiting. They'll have to wait a while to get something from this. But who knows? Mercedes have bounced back very many times. I'm great at my words today. They bounced back a lot of times we've seen. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Their journey is going to be a really interesting one, I think.
Well, absolutely, and this is what we wanted, right? This is what the regulations are brought in for, to reshuffle the pack, right, Ben? This is kind of tick box number one.
Yeah, it was always about this, was to reset things, and you know, it's not a complete reset, is it? In that the top three teams are the top three teams we kind of expected in terms of Ferrari, Red Bull, and Mercedes. It's just the order of those three teams has obviously altered, particularly with Mercedes. Although there have been some surprises further down the order, which I know we're going to be getting into, because some of that midfield order, and I have to say I was surprised. I know we're going to be talking about McLaren later, but I was surprised at how much they struggled this weekend, I have to say. Whereas, as we know, there were one or two other teams, Haas and Alfa Romeo, that had a very good start to the season.
Well, you know what? Let's just go to it then, shall we? Because I think it's fairly well documented. Red Bull, double DNF as well, with this supposed fuel pump issue and Sergio's engine seizing up as well. Absolute disaster for them. But what it did allow is for a really great results for those in the midfield, who already look strong as well. And it seems that actually the key to some of these new regulations is getting to grips with sort of these new tyres and braking proving really crucial as well. We saw so many of that midfield pack locking up into turn one a couple of times and going wide, losing positions. But ultimately, for the likes of Haas and Alfa Romeo, particularly with Kevin Magnussen and Bottas, this is the dream start, isn't it?
Yeah, it was. It's interesting you mentioned there about the braking, because Kevin Magnussen also had a couple of times he was locking up into turn one, but managed to keep it on the road in the end. But yeah, no, a fantastic start for Haas, and a really brilliant story after the struggles they've had and the off-track issues they faced as well. But obviously, it is a huge surprise, obviously, how competitive they look. But at the end of the day, that their whole plan was on 2022. They effectively sort of sacrificed last season to make sure that they had a good place to start this year, and it's probably exceeded their expectations. I'd say that, but yeah, no, a brilliant start and a great result for Kevin, which was really nice to see, because he's a fantastic driver, and it's great to have him back on the grid again. And it also shows how important it is for Haas to have that experienced driver, a strong driver who can deliver those kind of results. You know, would we be looking at that result had the lineup been the same as last season? I highly doubt that. So, yeah, a great start for Haas and Alfa Romeo too. They showed some pace in testing, and there are a few reliability worries there, but they seem to have, well, it didn't affect them in the first race anyway, and they got a solid double points finish, and yeah, so a really positive start for both those teams, and a surprise to see them as high up as they were. Like Ben said, McLaren struggles were a big shock, Aston Martin too, and Alpine sort of there or thereabouts again, but yeah, nothing really to shout about.
And those are big hitters as well, right, Claire? These are big manufacturers languishing at the back. It is, especially from McLaren as well. You know, we've been here before with them. This isn't the first time where they've been struggling at the back.